The first time I saw the bulldozer, I thought it had taken a wrong turn. It crawled over the hill like a slow yellow insect, pushing dust into the air behind it, heading straight toward the open stretch of land I had inherited from my grandfather 5 years ago. No roads led there. No signs pointed to it. No one had any reason to be on that property except me. I stood by the old wire fence, coffee still warm in my hand, watching the machine flatten wild grass that had grown undisturbed for decades. At first, I didn't panic. Mistakes happen. But then a second truck arrived. Then a third. Then survey flags started appearing across the field in straight, confident lines that made my stomach tighten. Someone wasn't guessing. Someone believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. That was the moment I went back to my truck and pulled out the metal box from under the seat. Inside it was the original deed, folded and refolded so many times the edges had softened like cloth. My grandfather used to keep it wrapped in plastic, saying land papers mattered more than money. I had laughed at that when I was younger. I wasn't laughing now. I checked the boundary description twice. Then again. The trees. The dry creek bed. The stone marker near the hill. Everything matched what I was looking at. They were building on my land. And the strange part? I didn't stop them. I didn't shout. I didn't call the police. I didn't wave the paper in the air like a warning flag. I just watched. Over the next week, the field transformed faster than I thought possible. Wooden stakes became chalk lines. Chalk lines became trenches. Concrete trucks poured foundations into soil that had never known anything heavier than rainwater. Workers laughed. Radios played. Supervisors walked around with clipboards, confident and relaxed. None of them even looked in my direction. To them, I was just a man standing near a fence. By the second week, I counted 11 foundations. By the third week, there were 20. I started filming everything with my phone. Dates. Faces. Company logos. Permit boards posted at the entrance. Every single detail, recorded calmly. Because a thought had settled into my mind, clear and steady. Sometimes the smartest move is letting people complete their mistake. When I saw the banner go up near the dirt road entrance Future Community by the HOA, I smiled for the first time. They had just labeled my evidence for me. And I knew, without any doubt, I was going to let them finish. By the end of the first month, the land no longer looked familiar. Where wild grass once moved with the wind, there were now straight dirt roads carved into the earth like scars. Concrete slabs dried under the sun in perfect rectangles. Wooden frames rose quickly, turning empty space into the skeletons of future homes. I came every day at the same time, parking my truck beside the old fence post that leaned slightly to the left. No one questioned my presence. Construction sites attract curious neighbors all the time. I kept my distance, phone in hand, quietly recording. I counted everything. 23 foundations became 37. 37 became 50. Trucks rolled in before sunrise and left after sunset. The pace was relentless, efficient, confident. Whoever approved this project believed completely in the paperwork behind it. That confidence fascinated me. One afternoon, a supervisor in a bright vest walked over and asked if I lived nearby. I nodded and pointed vaguely toward the hills. He smiled and said this place would look beautiful in a few months. I agreed politely. He had no idea he was complimenting my property. Each evening, I returned home and organized the videos by date. I took screenshots of permit boards posted near the entrance. The HOA logo appeared clearly on several of them. I even zoomed in to capture license plate numbers of company trucks. Evidence was building faster than the houses. Friends told me I was crazy for not saying anything. They said I should stop it before things went too far. But they didn't understand what I was seeing unfold. Every nail hammered into those frames increased the weight of what would come later. By the 6th week, roofs appeared. Rows of houses stood where cattle once grazed when my grandfather was alive. I could still hear his voice in my head, reminding me to check boundary stones after heavy rain. Those stones were still there, buried quietly along the tree line, watching this entire situation without moving. I visited them one evening and brushed dirt away from one with my shoe. Solid. Unchanged. Patient. Just like me. The first signboard went up near the entrance road, "Welcome to Silver Meadow Community." Clean lettering. Fresh paint. Optimism printed in bold. I filmed that too. That name would matter later. As the number of houses approached 70, I realized something important. This wasn't a small error. This was an entire neighborhood being confidently built in the wrong place. And they were almost halfway done. I folded the deed carefully and placed it back into the metal box. There was still time. And I was in no hurry at all. By the time the house count crossed 80, the construction site no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent. Streets had names now, printed on green metal signs bolted into fresh concrete. Curbs lined the dirt roads. Electrical poles stood upright like quiet witnesses, wires stretching neatly from one to another. This was no longer frames and foundations. This was a neighborhood. I walked along the fence line slowly each morning, noticing new details. Windows installed. Front doors painted. Driveways poured smooth and gray. Lawn seeded with bright green strips of hope that would soon grow into something families would call their own. That was the part that almost made me speak up. Almost. One afternoon, I saw a young couple walking through the site with a real estate agent. They held hands, smiling, pointing at one of the finished homes. The agent talked enthusiastically, gesturing toward the view of the hills, explaining how peaceful the area was. I wondered if she knew the peace came from the fact that no one was supposed to be there. I recorded that too, from a distance. My phone had become a silent witness to everything. Dates, progress, faces, conversations drifting through the air. I never zoomed too close. I never interfered. I simply observed. Because the thought in my mind had grown stronger with every passing day. Let them finish. The number 98 appeared on a whiteboard near the site office one morning. Total units, 98. Written in thick marker with pride. I stood there for a long time staring at that number. 98 houses on my grandfather's land. I drove home and took the deed out again, spreading it across my kitchen table. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the ink remained clear. Boundary lines. Measurements. Landmarks. All matching what I had memorized by now. I traced the line with my finger and realized something important. They hadn't made a small mistake. They had made a complete one. By the 10th week, mailboxes were installed. Street lights tested at night. Sidewalks dried under the sun. The place was ready for people. And that's when I knew my waiting was almost over. Because once families started moving in, the weight of this mistake would become too large to ignore quietly. I closed the deed, placed it back in the metal box, and locked it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would finally say something. But not here. Not on this dirt. Somewhere with walls, desks, and people who understood what paper really means. The next morning, I didn't go to the fence line. I drove straight to the temporary sales office set up near the entrance of the new neighborhood. The building was a portable cabin with large glass windows, banners fluttering outside, and cheerful posters showing smiling families in front of homes that stood on my land. I parked calmly and stepped out holding nothing but the folded deed inside a plain envelope. Inside, the air smelled like fresh paint and coffee. A receptionist looked up and greeted me with a professional smile. I asked if the project manager was available. She nodded and made a quick call. When he stepped out, he looked exactly like someone who believed everything was going perfectly. Clean shirt. Confident posture. Friendly expression. "How can I help you?" he asked. I placed the envelope on his desk and opened it slowly. I slid the deed toward him without saying a word. He glanced at it casually at first, expecting a complaint, a question, maybe a suggestion. Then his eyes slowed. His smile faded in small stages, like a light dimming gradually. He read the boundary description once. Then again. "I think you're mistaken," he said gently. I nodded. "That's what I thought too." I pulled out printed copies of county maps and laid them beside the deed. He leaned forward now, studying the lines carefully. His fingers traced the same curves I had memorized weeks ago. "This can't be right," he whispered. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply waited. He called someone from legal. Then someone from planning. The receptionist had stopped typing and was watching us quietly. Outside the glass window, I could see workers still moving confidently between houses, unaware of the shift happening inside this small room. Within 15 minutes, 2 men in suits arrived. They introduced themselves quickly and began examining the papers with serious attention. One of them asked me how long I had known. "Since the first bulldozer," I replied. They looked at me differently after that. Not angry. Not confused. Concerned. One of them asked why I hadn't stopped the construction. I shrugged gently. I wanted to be sure. The room felt heavier now. They requested time to verify everything at the county records office. I agreed immediately. As I stood to leave, I added one sentence quietly. "They're still building out there." No one responded. They didn't need to. The county records office had the kind of silence that makes paper sounds loud. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while old maps rested inside metal drawers that smelled faintly of dust and time. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying the same envelope, calm as ever. The project manager was already there, standing beside 2 lawyers and a county surveyor. None of them looked comfortable. We gathered around a wide wooden table as the surveyor spread out several maps side by side. One was the subdivision map the HOA had submitted months ago. Another was an older county boundary file. And then there was mine, the certified copy of the original deed map tied directly to my property taxes for decades. The surveyor began measuring distances carefully, comparing coordinates, tracing boundary lines with a metal ruler. No one spoke. Every small movement felt important. After several long minutes, he leaned back and removed his glasses. "The active construction site," he said slowly, "falls entirely within this boundary." He tapped my map. The project manager exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath for days. One of the lawyers muttered something under his breath. A county official quietly admitted that the HOA's approval had been processed using an outdated boundary reference submitted with the development plans. A clerical error, they called it. 98 houses built because of a clerical error. I didn't react. I had already accepted that reality weeks ago. They asked how this could be resolved. The question floated in the air, uncertain, heavy. I told them I preferred to let the proper process handle it. That answer made them more uneasy than any demand would have. Outside the window, I could see the tops of the new roofs in the distance. From here, they looked small. Fragile. Temporary. But on the ground, they were anything but. As we packed up the maps, one of the lawyers asked if I had hired an attorney yet. I told him not yet. His expression suggested that I should. Before leaving, I reminded them gently that construction was still ongoing. Workers were still adding value to the property every hour. This time, no one tried to argue. Because numbers don't bend for pride. And lines on a map don't move for convenience. The construction didn't stop all at once. It slowed first. The morning after the county meeting, fewer trucks arrived. Workers stood in small groups talking instead of moving with their usual speed. Nail guns fired less frequently. The loud rhythm that had filled the land for weeks began to fade into uncertain silence. No one made an announcement, but everyone felt it. Something was wrong. I stood by the fence again, watching the hesitation spread across the site like a quiet ripple. Supervisors checked their phones repeatedly. A few workers glanced in my direction more often than before, as if trying to understand whether I was connected to the sudden shift in energy. By afternoon, several vehicles left early. Equipment sat unused near half-finished driveways. The place that once felt unstoppable now felt paused mid-breath. That same evening, I received a formal letter from the HOA's legal team requesting a meeting. The wording was careful, filled with phrases like boundary clarification and ownership discussion. There was no mention of error, but the tone had changed completely. We met the next day in a conference room overlooking the nearly completed homes. 4 HOA board members sat across from me, along with 2 lawyers and the tired project manager. Through the window behind them, I could see rows of houses standing quietly under the sun. They asked what I wanted. I slid the deed across the table and said calmly, "I want you to understand that everything outside this window belongs to me. No threats. No anger. Just truth." One board member mentioned that families had already placed deposits. Another spoke about bank loans and construction contracts. The project manager stared out the window as if hoping the houses would disappear if he avoided looking at me. They offered to buy the land immediately. Quickly. Quietly. I asked for time to consider. Because I understood something they were only beginning to realize. The value of land changes when 98 houses are standing on it. And I had waited this long for a reason. The mediation meeting took place in a quiet office far from the construction site. No windows. No distractions. Just a long table, a ticking wall clock, and faces that carried the weight of sleepless nights. My attorney sat beside me, calm and observant. Across the table were the HOA lawyers, 2 board members, a financial consultant, and the project manager who now looked like he had aged several years in a few weeks. They began with numbers that belonged to a different reality. They calculated the value of the land as if it were still empty agricultural rates, rural comparisons, undeveloped estimates. Figures that might have worked months ago before roads, utilities, and foundations had changed everything. My attorney waited patiently, then slid a document forward. Updated valuation. Developed land rates. Installed infrastructure. Market housing values. Every addition they had built now increased what they effectively owed. The consultant leaned forward, reading carefully. One board member whispered something under her breath. The numbers on their side of the table suddenly felt small. They asked if I was trying to bankrupt the association. I reminded them quietly that I had never asked them to build anything. Hours passed. Coffee cooled in cups. Jackets were removed. Voices softened. This was no longer a negotiation about land. It was about consequences. At one point, the project manager spoke up. He said families were waiting to move into those homes. That loans had been approved. That lives were paused while we sat in this room. I listened without interruption. Then I said something simple. I never stopped you. Silence followed. Because that was the part they still couldn't understand. Why I had watched. Why I had waited. My attorney finally explained that if this returned to court without agreement, damages could extend beyond land value into legal penalties for unauthorized development. Time was no longer their friend. The consultant recalculated. Papers shifted. New numbers appeared. By late afternoon, they presented an offer that finally matched reality. Payment for the land at developed value. Additional compensation for unauthorized use. Coverage of legal costs. A number so large the room went quiet after it was spoken. My attorney looked at me. I nodded once. Pens were placed on the table. The agreement didn't change the land overnight, but it changed the mood instantly. Within 2 days of the signatures, construction noise returned like a switch had been flipped back on. Trucks rolled in early. Workers moved with renewed purpose. The hesitation that had hovered over the site disappeared, replaced by relief and urgency. I drove out there that morning and stood by the fence again, watching the place come back to life. The project manager noticed me from a distance and walked over. His expression wasn't defensive anymore. It was tired, but respectful. He offered his hand. This time, I shook it. No words were needed. We both understood the strange journey that had brought us here. The Silver Meadow sign near the entrance had been cleaned and repainted. Fresh grass had started growing along the sidewalks. Mailboxes now stood in neat rows, waiting for names instead of numbers. Families had begun visiting the finished homes again. Children ran along driveways while parents spoke with agents. The neighborhood looked hopeful, unaware of how close it had come to becoming something very different. I filmed the scene one last time, not as evidence now, but as a reminder. I walked along the tree line where the old boundary stones still rested in the soil. I brushed dirt away from one with my shoe and smiled. Those stones had remained still while everything else changed around them. They had simply waited. Just like I had. As the sun lowered toward the hills, warm light spilled across rooftops that used to be open field. I realized I didn't feel victorious. I felt calm. Patient decisions don't create excitement when they pay off. They create quiet satisfaction. My phone buzzed with notifications from local news outlets asking for comments about the situation. I ignored them all. This had never been about attention. It had been about timing. I took one last look across the rows of houses before heading back to my truck. The difference now was simple. They knew. Weeks passed, and the sound of construction slowly faded into ordinary neighborhood life. Lawnmowers hummed on weekends. Porch lights glowed softly in the evenings. Cars lined driveways where concrete had once dried under the sun. If someone drove past Silver Meadow now, they would never imagine what had happened beneath those streets. To them, it was just another peaceful community. To me, it was a reminder of what patience can do when paired with proof. Sometimes I drove by without stopping, just to observe. Children waiting for school buses. Neighbors waving across fences. Delivery vans dropping packages at doors. The place looked settled, permanent, exactly as it was meant to be. Friends still asked why I hadn't stopped the construction on the first day. Why I didn't walk in waving the deed when the first bulldozer arrived. I always gave them the same answer. Because I wanted them to finish. They laughed when I said it, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The metal box with the deed now sat back under the seat of my truck, right where it had been before all this began. The paper hadn't changed. The land hadn't moved. Only the circumstances around it had shifted. One evening, I parked near the old fence line during sunset and stepped out. Golden light washed over rooftops that used to be open grass. I could almost picture my grandfather standing beside me, leaning on the wire, nodding quietly as if he understood every step I had taken. Patience isn't passive. It's deliberate. It's watching people build their own consequences while you hold the truth quietly in your hands.
The HOA never connected me again after the agreement. There was nothing left to say. The problem had been solved in the most expensive ways possible. As I turned to leave, I looked back on a final time at the silver edged sign near the entrance. It stood firm, polished, proud, a symbol of community built on a mistake that taught everyone involved a lesson they would never forget. And I realized something simple. They had built 98 house, but I had built the case.